Some scholars will admit, yes, all sorts of things can be cured psychosomatically. And sometimes they may be right. I mean, some cures probably are psychosomatic. We're still grateful for the cures in any case. And God can work through that as well. But they say some other kinds of things are physically impossible, and we know that those things will not happen. And one of the examples that they typically give is raisings from the dead. So I have interviewed people who claim to have witnessed people being raised from the dead. I have a very good friend in Nigeria. We did some ministry together, but I'd never asked him about miracles because I wasn't working on this book. But because of his other kinds of experiences, I thought, well, I can ask him about miracles once I was working on the book. And he said, oh, I just have a few stories I can tell you right now, but one of the stories that he gave me was in a village where he was doing evangelism. The neighbor child died, and they brought the boy over to where he was staying and said, can you do anything? So he picked the boy up in his arms, took him into the room, prayed for a couple hours, and brought the boy back to them alive. Of course, they were impressed. I have other reports of that. Another person from Nigeria, I was giving a paper on miracle reports in the majority world and how that might affect our readings of biblical texts. I was giving a report on that in a Society of Biblical Literature meeting, and at the end there were some questions, and one professor from Nigeria stood up and said, now this may seem strange to some of you in the West, but when my child was born, he was stillborn. Apparently he died in the womb at some earlier point. And we prayed for 20 minutes. And at the end of 20 minutes, he revived. And he didn't have brain damage. He just recently finished his master's degree at the University of London. What brought it home to me more closely was when I was visiting my wife's country. My wife is from Congo-Brazzaville. And she took me around and introduced me to people in her church circles. Now, her denomination is Église Évangélique du Congo, the Evangelical Church of Congo. It's the mainline Protestant denomination in Congo, largest Protestant denomination there. But this isn't the large Congo, this is the small Congo. It's just 4 million people. But within the span of 3 weeks, to my astonishment, I received 7 eyewitness accounts of people being raised from the dead. And one of those accounts came from my own mother-in-law. I'd already heard about this story. That was why I wanted to interview her about it. It pertained to my sister-in-law, Therese. When Therese was about 2 years old, she cried out that she was bitten by a snake, and by the time her mother got to her, she was not breathing. There was nothing she could do, no medical help available in the village where they were staying at that time. So she strapped Therese to her back, and she ran to a nearby village where a friend of theirs, an evangelist, was, to ask him to pray, Koko Ngoma Moise. And he prayed, Therese started breathing, and the next day she was fine. And now Therese has a master's degree. I asked my mother-in-law, how long was Therese not breathing? And so she stopped and thought about, going up this hill, going down that hill, how long it took to get from one village to the other. She said about 3 hours. We have many other reports of this experience. A well-known cardiologist in Florida had an experience with this, where the person was dead, clinically dead. For 40 minutes they'd been trying to revive him. Finally they gave up. And as Dr. Crandall was walking out, he'd already pronounced him dead. He felt urged by the Holy Spirit to go back, and he went back in, and said, "Father, if you want this man to have another chance, please revive him, raise him from the dead," and asked his colleague who had just walked back into the room with him to shock him with the paddle one more time. And the man instantly, with that one shock, came back to a normal heartbeat, and didn't suffer the brain damage. I mean, he was, and I have a number of other stories like this, some of them from doctors, and a number of eyewitnesses from around the world. A woman in the Philippines that I interviewed, who was dead for 1 hour and 45 minutes some years before I interviewed her. Very humble, weeping as she told her story about God's kindness to her. Now, this is not just a new claim. You have claims like this, eyewitness claims in the Church Fathers, as well as in the New Testament. You have in John Wesley's journal one day where there was a Mr. Myrick who was dead. Wesley and he had both been sick at the same time, but Wesley recovered. Mr. Myrick died. Wesley prayed for him. Mr. Myrick came back to life. As far as they knew, he was dead. In many of these cases, we have no means of testing it, but in some of these cases, the people were dead for 24 hours or more. There are just so many reports of this from around the world. Now, obviously, most people who are dead stay dead, including in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, but we do have a number of reports of this, and people cannot say that we don't have eyewitness reports of this, and have no reason to doubt that there could be eyewitness reports of this in the first century as well.